Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
The Roman legions, they would march across the Mediterranean world, making new conquests for the glory and profit of Rome. How did a culture that so stressed discipline and seriousness of purpose become a synonym for conspicuous consumption and public display? The rise of Rome, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA Professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
At the beginning of the 5th century BC, when the Greeks were busy throwing back the Persians, a small, barely civilized city-state to the west of Greece was fighting for its life. It sat on a peninsula that was dominated by Gaulish tribes in the north, Etruscan warriors in the center, Greek cities to the south. But within 200 years, this insignificant city called Rome grew up to become master of all Italy and was on the verge of conquering the entire Mediterranean world. It would prove so successful that its myth would endure for 2,000 years, even into our own century. In 800 AD, Charlemagne had himself crowned Roman emperor centuries after Rome's empire had collapsed. In 1804, Napoleon had himself crowned in the same tradition, and he called his heir the King of Rome. Even the Russian Tsars, like Peter here, claimed to rule from the Third Rome, better known as Moscow. And in this century, in Rome itself, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini would name his system of government fascism, after the emblem of authority of ancient Roman magistrates. This extraordinary myth began, as most myths do, in a rather modest way. Rome, like so many other ancient centers, was blessed by geography. The city lay on a fertile plain that could support a relatively dense population with its grain, vegetables, and fruit. Rome also had the advantage of straddling the Tiber River just 15 miles from the sea, where boats could still come upriver. At this point there was first a ford, then a bridge, and across it ran the main north-south road and all the trade that came with it. The bridge was so important to the Romans that it was considered sacred, and the official charged with its upkeep was sacred as well. He was called the Pontifex, and his title lives on in the title of the Roman Catholic Pope, the Pontiff. So Rome began as a market town and a farming community. This is a sign from a greengrocer's shop whose owner likely shared his neighbor's tough-minded, practical, conservative outlook. The virtues the Romans admired were all related to discipline and self-discipline. They believed in pietas, respect for established authority and tradition. They believed in fides, being true to your responsibilities. In religio, the common beliefs that bind men together, and above all, in gravitas, the sober seriousness that marks a real man. Even the word virtue means manliness. Early Roman society was also strictly patriarchal. A Middle Eastern Greek, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, explained it. The lawgiver of the Romans gave virtually full power to the father over his son, even during his whole life, whether he thought proper to imprison him, to scourge him, to put him in chains and keep him at work in the fields, or put him to death. And this even though the son already engaged in public affairs, though he were numbered among the highest magistrates, though he were celebrated for his zeal for the commonwealth. As for women, they didn't think much of them or about them. A Roman in the 1st century BC wrote to his wife, "If, good luck to you, you bear offspring, if it is male, let it live. If it is female, expose it," which, of course, meant leaving it to die. One gets the clear impression that there wasn't much kidding around with ancient Romans, as you can see for yourself. They disliked disorder and luxury, which meant excess. The legend of how Rome was founded is a case in point. These are Romulus and Remus, twin brothers who were raised by a she-wolf. Remus refused to follow Romulus's strict orders to behave while the sacred boundaries of Rome were being traced. He jumped over them as if they didn't matter, and Romulus killed him. The moral of this story is that serious things should not be taken lightly. True virtue subordinates the person to the city, the individual to the state. On this solid base of gravitas, or true gravity, the Roman Republic was founded in the 6th century BC. The Romans were a conservative people, and so they wanted strong leaders, but not too strong. So the city's wealthy aristocrats, the patricians, who pretty much monopolized state office, elected 2 of their kind to the executive office of consul, but only for 1 year. These consuls had vast powers, but they were constrained by law and custom and by the power of the Senate, the main legislative branch. Since the consuls left office to sit as senators for the rest of their lives, it was a foolish consul who totally ignored or defied the will of the Senate. The Roman army also mirrored the values of this hard-bitten society. Every soldier provided his own equipment, which meant that he had to have a farm or some kind of property so he could have the necessary resources to buy a shield and helmet, a sword, a spear, and a pack on his back. If you didn't have all this, you didn't get into the army. So the landless poor did not fight. They were called the proletariat because their only contribution to the state was their proles, or offspring. They didn't pay taxes, and they had no say in how the city was run. Commoners in general were known as plebeians, and they could be small farmers, artisans, servants of the patrician landowners. For 2 centuries, the more prosperous among them would struggle for political and social rights with mixed success. But it was their army service that gave them their greatest bargaining power. The primary attraction of life in the army was a very important fringe benefit, the spoils of war. And the potential for these spoils was going to increase dramatically after a war in the 4th century BC with the Samnites, a people who lived in the mountains to the southeast of Rome. At the beginning of the war with the Samnites, the Roman army fought like this, in the phalanx, a tight formation without much room to maneuver. But then they switched to smaller self-contained units of 120 men called maniples. 3 maniples made a cohort of 360 men, and 10 cohorts made a legion. These smaller units could operate in a checkerboard pattern that allowed for a lot of flexibility. But they also made greater demands on the individual soldier, and they could be perfected only by strict training and discipline. So these Roman infantry were invariably better trained than their opponents. The legions proved so superior in discipline and determination to the cruder troops of Rome's neighbors that by the middle of the 3rd century BC, the city on the Tiber controlled nearly all of the peninsula. It was then that the Romans did something that turned their military advantage into an even greater political advantage. Instead of slaughtering or enslaving their defeated enemies, as was the fashion, the Romans made them allies. They took some of their land to settle Romans, and they didn't treat them all alike because the Senate's maxim was divide and rule. But on the whole, each conquered Italian state was allowed to run its own affairs. All that Rome asked was control of the state's foreign policy and military aid in time of war. It was an extremely liberal arrangement for those days, and it was eventually followed by the extension of Roman citizenship throughout the rest of Italy. So Rome gained the attachment of neighboring states in a way that no Greek city ever managed. These attachments were then cemented by building first-class roads which provided concrete bonds, quite literally, where ideological bonds might not have sufficed. Examples of Roman skill in civil engineering are everywhere you look in Italy today. This is an ancient sewer. And these are the ruins of a Roman aqueduct. They serve to remind us that technology can have long-lasting political uses as well as practical ones. By 270 BC or so, their last enemies on the peninsula, the Greek cities in the south, had been brought to heel. But once Rome controlled this territory, she was going to be drawn into the wider Mediterranean sphere and would collide with the Carthaginians, the Greeks' chief business rivals and enemies. This is an artist's conception of Carthage as it might have been in the 3rd century BC when it went to war with Rome. What had begun more than 500 years earlier as a Phoenician colony in North Africa had become the greatest naval power in the Western Mediterranean. In Rome, the Senate was under increasing pressure to protect the southern cities from Carthage after the Carthaginians got mixed up in a local war in Sicily, thus upsetting the balance of power. The Senate was reluctant, but then it gave in to popular demand in 264 BC, and the first of 3 Punic Wars began, Punic meaning Phoenician. The wars with Carthage would do 2 very important things to Rome. First, in order to beat a naval power, Rome had to become one, which it did. These are Roman shipbuilders helping Rome rule the waves, as every Mediterranean empire must, whether it's Athens 2 centuries before or Turkey 1700 years later. Like all sailors in the ancient Mediterranean, the Romans used galleys propelled by rowers. Galleys were invented by the Egyptians, who could sail down the Nile but needed to row back upriver. By the time the First Punic War was over 24 years later, Rome had made Sicily a province and was soon to add Corsica and Sardinia and move into Spain, a Carthaginian stronghold. Which brings us to the second result of the Punic Wars. All this territory was won by Rome's fleet, which was built to win a single war, but which ended by gaining an empire. The Romans had never meant to be drawn so far away from home, but the fleet ensured that they would be. After Rome defeated Carthage, she went on to defeat the Macedonians, the Greeks, the Asian heirs of Alexander the Great, and finally Egypt as well. But there were some close calls. The Second Punic War began in 218 BC when Hannibal, a Carthaginian general, set out from Spain to invade Italy. Since the Romans now controlled the sea, Hannibal had to go overland through 1,000 miles of hostile territory. When he made it across the first obstacle, the Pyrenees, he had about 40,000 soldiers and 37 African elephants, which were meant to strike terror in the hearts of Rome. By the time he crossed the Alps, however, he had less than half his troops and almost no elephants. Nevertheless, Hannibal was so brilliant a general that he beat the Romans to a pulp. He outwitted them, outfought them, and by 216 BC he was camping under the walls of Rome itself. If Hannibal had succeeded as well in his political strategy as he had in his military strategy, the history of Western civilization might have been quite different. But when he called on the other Italian cities to join him against Rome, they turned a deaf ear. Rome's liberal policy towards them had paid off. While Hannibal hung around looking for support, the Roman fleet cut off his supplies and then landed troops first in Spain, then in North Africa near Carthage itself. Hannibal was forced to return home to defend his territory, and Rome was saved. When Carthage foolishly went to war one more time 2 generations later, the angry Romans obliterated the city, literally tearing it down. The Punic Empire was no more. By this time, Rome itself had profoundly changed in all sorts of ways. For one thing, the old Roman infantry, which had been formed by annual levies, was replaced by professional infantry, which signed up for long tours of duty and was paid by the state or by generals from the booty they captured. So you could use the troops for long campaigns, which were more attractive now because they could pay for themselves and even return a profit. What had begun as a quest to defend Roman borders against Carthage and against other hostile states eventually became a brutal search for territory and riches. This is how Plutarch describes a Roman victory celebration or triumph. The triumph lasted for 3 days. On the first, which was scarcely long enough for the sight, would be seen the statues, pictures, colossal images taken from the enemy, drawn upon 250 chariots. On the second day was carried in a great many wagons the finest and richest armor of the Macedonians, both of brass and steel. On the third day first came the trumpeters, who did not sound as they were wont in a procession or solemn entry, but such a charge as the Romans use when they encourage the soldiers to fight. followed by young men wearing frocks with ornamented borders, who led to the sacrifice 120 stalled oxen. The more enemies to defeat, of course, the more jobs for soldiers and for the patricians and their hangers-on as well, who would be sent out to govern and tax and squeeze the provinces. This became the basis of Roman foreign policy, a very different spirit from the sensible federal approach they had followed in Italy itself. The spreading empire had other effects. It brought Rome into close contact with more sophisticated cultures. It suggested new tastes, new fashions, new luxuries unknown to the sober, frugal, older generations. The loot of a dozen regions was now flowing into Rome, and young gentlemen were learning to admire beautiful things and to collect them and to talk about them, while old gentlemen deplored the decadence this represented. Display and conspicuous consumption and luxus at its worst. There were lots of Romans making money in the 2nd and the 1st century BC, and quite naturally they wanted to show off their wealth. This is also when expensive homes began to include a vomitorium, a room where you could go and vomit what you had just eaten, so you could go back out and eat and drink another meal. It's hard to imagine a better example of conspicuous consumption. This is what the Tribune Sallust had to say about the morals of his time. As soon as wealth came to be a mark of distinction and an easy way to renown, to military commands, to political power, virtue began to decline. Poverty was now looked on as a disgrace, and a blameless life as a sign of ill nature. Riches made the younger generation a prey to luxury, avarice, pride, squandering with one hand what they grabbed with the other. They set small value on their own property while they coveted that of others. Honor and modesty, all laws, human and divine, were alike disregarded in a spirit of recklessness and intemperance. Conspicuous consumption and large-scale display also became a part of politics. In 65 BC, Julius Caesar paid for 400 lions and 320 pairs of gladiators to fight and murder each other in one single show, all to amuse the public and gain political support. And along this main road, the famous Appian Way, you could see 6,000 crosses, each with its own crucified rebel slave. This new interest in public display also affected art. Honorific statues, portraits, historical paintings, political advertising of all kinds were everywhere. beauty now fulfilled a public function and was heavily involved in propaganda and publicity. This concern for impressing people explains why architecture becomes the Roman art par excellence. The idea of empire would be manifested in great, solemn, spectacular buildings like these. Temples, palaces, triumphal arches and columns, reflecting the grandeur of Rome and sometimes delusions of grandeur. Colossal pride made for colossal proportions, as the Colosseum, Rome's huge stadium, attests. The greater the proportions, the greater the power of Rome. The richer the decorations, the richer the Roman people seem destined to become. So even if you were a poor Roman, you could still participate vicariously in this orgy of conspicuous consumption and self-congratulation. But was it enough? For a while, yes, but eventually the strain of gaining and then holding on to such a huge amount of territory was going to take its toll on the Republic, especially on its poorer citizens. We shall see how in our next program, which is about the Roman Empire.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPD to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.